Thank you all very much for coming. I'm Jude Brown, the Director of the University of Cambridge Centre for Gender Studies, and it's my great pleasure to chair today's Humanitas lecture, run by Crash and supported by the Institute of Strategic Dialogue. And of course, this year's Humanitas visiting professor on women's rights is Professor Siddiqui, who holds the chair in Muslim chair in Islamic and Interreligious Studies at the University of Edinburgh. And of course, she's already given us 3 brilliant lectures, and they're all available on Crash's website. Today we're going to bring them all together in a discussion, and we've got some excellent people here to help us do that. And in this first session, which is entitled Belonging and Identity, What Role Do Art and Literature Play for Redefining Women's Rights, we have Razia Iqbal, who is the arts correspondent for the BBC.
Not anymore, I was.
Oh. What would you like? You could tell us what you do. And also Elif Şafak, who is a Turkish author who's written extensively on women, religion and culture. So the way that we're going to structure this session is that each of them is going to tell us their thoughts on Professor Siddiqui's lectures, and then... Is this on? Okay.
Not sure it's on.
So the way, I'll try to speak a bit louder. The way that we're going to structure this session is that our commenters are going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, their thoughts on Professor Siddiqui's lectures, and then Professor Siddiqui is going to give us a response, and then we're going to open out out to a Q&A. So let us start then with Razia, and perhaps you could tell us more, and forgive me for getting that wrong, about your thoughts. Thank you.
If I speak at this sort of level, can everyone hear me? Because I prefer not to stand up. Can everyone hear me? No, I can't. I'll stand up. I don't know if any... Oh, it is working. Yeah, I'm not the arts correspondent for the BBC anymore. I used to be about 4 years ago. I present 2 programmes on the BBC, a books programme, which is a half-hour interview programme with leading authors called Talking Books, which is on international television for the BBC. You can't often watch it here. And I also present a daily current affairs programme on the World Service on radio called NewsHour. I'm hoping that some of the things that I'm going to say will be partially in response to what Mona's lectures covered, but I'm also going to take a slightly tangential view of it. I'm going to talk about 2 things. The bigger picture for me, because this is one that I'm involved in virtually every day as a presenter of NewsHour. I want to really look at the bigger subject matter that's listed in the programme, which is women's rights, a litmus test for democracy, and focus on 2 countries where there is a very clear and obvious ongoing project in pursuit of democracy. Afghanistan first. I don't think anyone who's been following what's happening in Afghanistan will fail to notice that there have, in the last 5 years, been huge improvements in things like maternal mortality and the increase of girls going to school. But it remains one of the worst places in the world to be a woman today. And there are increasingly conservative and reactionary forces who are opposed to women having really any place, any role, any voice, any space outside the home. And they are gathering strength. And I think it's quite possible and fairly probable, I think, that the Conservatives will continue to chip away at the gains that have been made in Afghanistan once Western forces leave. And it's certainly true that many women in Afghanistan fear this, because they will use that as a bargaining chip in peace talks with the Taliban. And I think set against that is the positives, which connects with what Mona was talking about yesterday, which is that there is a determination amongst women themselves to take every opportunity that they are presented with and is made available to them. Women who are acutely aware that they are trailblazers. They are the first in their family to go to college or school. a lot of women one of whom I interviewed not that long ago, who is standing for the presidential campaign, who feel that they are, if not doing it for themselves for the very first time, they are trailblazers for the next generation and indeed their daughters. So there's Afghanistan, and then there's Egypt, where women were absolutely at the heart of the revolution 3 years ago, the January the 25th revolution. 18 days in which it seemed to everyone, both inside Egypt and outside, that they would transform their society. And because women were at the heart of that revolution, it felt, for the first time for many women, that they were going to be part of that democratic project. 3 years on, it is now a country where sexual harassment and violence against women is at an unprecedented level. And I think partly why I've outlined those two very, very brief sketches of what's happening to women in those two countries where there is an ongoing project for democracy is because I wanted to raise the issue of what happens when there is an organic movement to try and change lives for women set against public policy and politics. Because when Mona was talking yesterday about how women in their ordinary lives, in their normal lives, are negotiating and navigating relationships in the way that women all over the world do, and create gains for themselves, lose, try harder, and so on. I wanted to set those two countries up for a possible way in which we can talk about the gap between politics and ordinary lives. And I think the reason why I feel very strongly about that is because I think it's worth us looking at what an Islamic revival in many of these countries, a reactionary Islamic revival in these countries, means for women. Because it sets them against, in some cases, implacable, monolithic views about them. And they are absolutely at the heart of what is being fought for. If you believe in social justice, if you believe that equality for all means progress for all, then social justice for women is absolutely at the heart of any democratic project. And I feel very, very strongly that if what we're going to talk about a little bit today is social justice for women, it has to be seen through the prism of the politics under which they live and the politics, in some cases, which is imposed on them, particularly in the two countries that I mentioned. I interviewed for this books programme that I mentioned the novelist Khaled Hosseini, who's only written 3 novels. The first 2, The Kite Runner and, what's it called? Thousand Splendid Suns, thank you. Just 2 sold 38 million copies. 2 novels. Eye-watering figures, really. He lives in America, but all 3 of his novels, the last one and The Mountains Echoed, has just come out, and I'm sure that's going to do very well too. His subject matter has always been Afghanistan. A Thousand Splendid Suns focused entirely on women, although there were male characters in the books. I mention him because when I interviewed him, he said that the future of Afghanistan laid with its women. And I was very struck by that very simple sentence. And when I asked him to explain, he said, Afghanistan will be nothing if the power, the strength, the determination of women is harnessed, garnered, and focused on. And in a way, I think that's so important because as a novelist who has sold so many books, his ideas on the page, and I know people say people don't read novels anymore. They do. A lot of women read novels, and a lot of women read Khaled Hosseini's novels. Although he gives us a view of Afghanistan which is always going to be partial, it's also a space where he is saying the voices of women matter, their stories matter. And we have here today in Elif Şafak someone who does exactly the same in her novels. And I feel so strongly about the power of imagining a space for women, which novels allow the reader and the writer to do, because the reader can imagine what it's like to live as a woman in Turkey or a woman in Afghanistan. And although I'm stating completely the obvious, and I'm very happy to be slapped down as saying something that's really quite trite, it's so important. I cannot tell you how important it is, except by telling you now, very quickly, the small picture. So I've outlined those two big stories, Egypt, Afghanistan, and the small picture is mine. I grew up in a fairly orthodox South Asian Muslim family in London. Came to London when I was 8, and my father was very, very controlling. Didn't want me to go to university, didn't want me to be educated, not because he didn't believe in education, I think he did, but I think he was scared of it. And I fought very, very hard. And the reason I fought is very, very simple. At the age of 15, I was sent by my comprehensive school in South London. I was taken to the theatre. And we went to see a production of The Greeks, it was called. And it was the Royal Shakespeare Company when they were in the Aldwych. They had their own theatre at the time. And I was 15, and I'd never been to the theatre before, ever. And I came out of the theatre and I cried. And the teacher said, "What on earth's the matter with you? Why are you crying?" And everyone else was kind of like, "Oh yeah, that was a great afternoon spent," or not. And I said, "I would like to know who these writers are." I had never, ever seen storytelling quite like it. So for me, personally, it changed my life. It made me feel that writing, the power of storytelling, being given access to powerful storytelling, was a window that I had never been able to look into. Not because I didn't go to school, I did. I was given books. I didn't have any books at home. My family was very working class. My father was illiterate. He taught himself how to read and write. It was so important that the notion that here was a space, it didn't matter that these writers that I was completely drawn to were men. It mattered not a jot. What mattered was the power of their stories. And for me, that feels absolutely crucial. The crucible in which women can find a space, a role, something that they can fashion for themselves. And you don't have to be a creator to do that. You can be a consumer and still feel completely empowered by stories and storytelling. So for me, the gap between the big picture, the policymakers, the politics, the people who impose things, and people on the ground who are trying to make the best of their lives, is not so huge. It really isn't, because there is huge power to be had in being a part of the written word, being a part of, doesn't have to be the written word, it can be oral storytelling, being part of, even me talking to you now, me having told you that story about my teenage years. We're all storytellers. We all engage in a way that makes us very, very powerful. And I think we underestimate our own power if we don't think about it in that way.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored, very happy to be in the presence of Professor Siddiqui and Razia Iqbal. I would like to tell you a little bit about my background, my upbringing, and why stories matter to me, why words matter to me. I was born in Strasbourg in France, and shortly afterwards my parents separated and I came to Turkey with my mother. And at the time she was a college student who had dropped out of university for love. And so when she came back to Turkey with a baby in her arms, she had no diploma, no money, no job, and nowhere to go. And it was my grandmother, maternal grandmother, who opened her house to us. And I spent part of my childhood with my maternal grandmother. These two women, I think in some ways I see myself as the creation of these two women, my mother and my grandmother. They were very different from one another. My mother was very westernized, educated, feminist, modern, urban, rational, and my grandmother was very Eastern, if I may say, very spiritual. She wore a headscarf. She was very irrational in her own way, superstitious. And in her house, I would always see these, evil eye beads, coffee, fortune telling. I grew up observing these things. But what struck me most, and I think what left an impact on my life and perhaps on my personality, is the solidarity that I have seen between these two women. Because in the 1970s, I'm talking about Ankara, a very middle-class Muslim neighborhood, very conservative, very enclosed. A divorcee would be immediately married off to, probably to a man who would be much older than her, because she's not a virgin anymore, right? So in the marital market, she has dropped down. But instead of marrying her off immediately, because there would be people who wanted to make those marital arrangements for my mother so that she wouldn't be a single woman, a dangerous single woman. It was my grandmother who said, wait a minute, she's not going to marry right now. She'll go back to university. Yeah? I'm going to take care of the baby. And Safak, who's my mother, was going to go to college, get her diploma, graduate, have a job, and then if she wants to marry, then she can go for it. So in a way, it was my traditional grandmother who believed in my mother's education and who opened up the path for her. And I do believe in that kind of sisterhood, and I do believe in that kind of solidarity. I come from a land where words matter, books matter, storytelling matters. The good side is, of course, books don't evaporate too fast in Turkey, and novelists are, maybe it's not the good side, but novelists are a bit like public figures, in that sense stories do matter, but the downside is words are dangerous. Words can, bring you to court, to trials, so it has that negative aspect as well. But storytelling is a very, very old tradition in Turkey and in lands such as ours. Turkey is a very fast-moving country. It's a very future-oriented country. And in some ways, I think it's an interesting case in the entire Islamic world, in the entire Muslim world, in the sense that it is a country where westernization, modernization, and secularization have been carried to the furthest extreme possible. Yeah? And the whole transformation has been realized throughout its history. What do I mean by that? Usually in many Muslim societies we see when there's a westernization process, usually the technology of the West is being adopted and there's a transformation in the public space, but the private space is not that much changed. By private space, I mean the space of women, the space of mothers, sisters, daughters. In the case of Turkey, that space was also altered, transformed throughout its history. And it's a society of incredible conflicts and paradoxes. On the one hand, you will see lots of women in Turkey who are quite vocal, visible, active in many areas, right? From media to medicine, from arts to academia. Huge number of Turkish and Kurdish women, very vocal, very active. But at the same time, you will see honor killings, rape, incest, an increase in domestic violence, again, within the same country, happening exactly at the same time. So Turkey is full of such paradoxes. And in my opinion, politics always changes faster in such lands than sexual politics. So when it comes to gender and sexuality, there's almost a resistance, a reluctance to change. And this is something that I observe across the board. So it's not only the so-called conservatives, but I think, people you wouldn't expect to be gender biased, them too can be very homophobic, can be very sexist in their own way. It's something that we see across the ideological board. Now, when I look at the literary world today, I think I totally agree with what Razia said. I mean, stories matter. It's important that we share our stories. On the other hand, I don't think the literary world is very immune to identity politics. There is almost an expectation that if you happen to be a woman writer from a Muslim background, cultural background, then you should be telling the stories of Muslim women, then you should be telling realistic stories. And this is something that worries me a little bit, because I'm worried that we start to attribute a function to fiction, especially for, let's say, if an Algerian woman writer, or a Moroccan woman writer, or a Turkish woman writer, because it's not the avant-garde side of art or literature that is expected from us, but mostly to tell stories to the world about our reality. However, for me, fiction is imagination, you know. For me, fiction is inspiration, empathy. I would like to write maybe about Turkish women in one book, but in another book I might write about, you know, gypsies or someone in Norway, someone in China. Why not? So that kind of flexibility, that kind of openness, which is almost only possible in art and literature, is taken from us. And this is something that worries me, and maybe we will talk about if we have time. Yet at the same time, as has been said earlier, most of the readers, in not only in Turkey, all around the world, are women. If books, especially the genre of the novel, survives today, I really honestly think we owe it mostly to women. Women buy more books than men. Women read more than men. But on top of that, I think women, when they like a book, they share it with other people, which is very important. So a book is not an individual object. You read it, then you give it to your boyfriend, you give it to your husband, you send it to your aunt or uncle. I have many male readers, especially in Turkey, who come to me and say, you know, my wife reads you, and because of her I started reading you as well. So there's that aspect of, you know, information, stories circulating within the society, I think, thanks to women again. And yet at the same time, when we look at the bigger picture, I think when we look at the critics, poets, you know, columnists, novelists, all of that adding up the entire map is mostly male-dominated. So it is as if women read, men write. Yeah? And this is something that needs to change, especially in our parts of the world. And it is a pity because at the same time, as Razia said so beautifully, women are great storytellers. They are the transmitters of memory, especially in lands such as Turkey, where there's a lot of collective amnesia. I think it is women who transfer this oral culture from one generation to the next, from grandmothers to granddaughters. However, this is something that the written culture usually looks down upon. It is not very much appreciated, you know, because the oral culture is thought to be full of superstitions, you know, things that are not very literary or intellectual. So there is a gap between oral culture and written culture, which also worries me. But on top of that, I sincerely believe that women need stories, especially in order to preserve their individuality. To be an individual is very difficult in patriarchal societies. We're always somebody's wife, somebody's mother, somebody's daughter, but to exist on our own as individuals, to be seen as individuals, is a very, very hard struggle. However, especially the novel for me, because it's the loneliest form of art, speaks to individuality. Yeah? And this is a very different language than politics. So even though I believe that novels and novelists can make a huge political change or can have political effects, I think the language we speak is different than the language of politics. Because at the end of the day, politics is based on a distinction between us versus them. It is based on collective identities. Religion, especially organized religion, is based on us versus them and the assumption that us is better than them. However, in art, we speak the language of individuality. When I write a novel, I am alone. When you read a novel, you are alone. Or when I read a novel, I am alone. So especially the novel thrives upon solitude. And I believe that human beings, by nature, are more open-minded and are more open-hearted when they are alone than amidst other people. Fascism is always a collectivistic movement. Yeah? When we are with other people, we are less tolerant. When we are with other people, we're more judgmental. I have many homophobic readers, maybe they are homophobic in their daily life, but when they are alone in their room, yeah, reading a book on their own, they can connect with a gay character in a book. Or I have readers who are very biased towards maybe minorities or other religions, Christians, Jews, or this or that. But when they're reading a novel, a story about that person, they connect. Or I have readers who are very biased towards women wearing headscarves. But in a book, they read a woman with a headscarf and they connect with that person. So how does that happen? I think we enter into a different zone and we speak to individuality, to the individual's mind and to the individual's heart. For me, that language, that connection, that bond is very important. Yet at the same time, I think the sheer fact that one is a woman doesn't situate that writer almost automatically outside a masculinist discourse. We need more than that. We need a certain awareness. I think we need sisterhood. We need a new discourse that doesn't fall into the traps of mainstream politics and political discourses. I do sincerely believe that we need a new post-feminism, a kind of feminism that appreciates the work of previous generations of women and wants to continue, but at the same time wants to move it into a new terrain because the world has changed a lot. So I also believe that this post-feminism, or a large chunk of it, has to come from outside the West, especially from countries with an overwhelming Muslim majority, because we have listened to so many stories in which we have been associated with oppression, unhappiness, some kind of gloom. I think it is time for all of us to start telling the world and to ourselves new stories, new and surprising stories, completely outside the box, about new Muslim women. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, and welcome back, those people who've been at the lectures. Can I just welcome the male members of this audience? It's why should anything on women and gender be dominated by women alone? So I just want to, not that I'm being sexist here, but I really do want to welcome the mixed audience. Both the speakers, both the respondents have talked about stories. I've just come off the phone from my sister. She's a barrister, and she was having lunch with a QC, another female QC, and she said, the QC was telling her that, when I go to chambers, I really have to dumb myself down, otherwise I'll have no friends. And it was really quite sad. She was laughing about it, but she said, that's a reality of, and I allude to one of the things I was talking about yesterday, about how women are silenced, even learned women and educated women, in different and subtle ways. And I think the fact that we silence women in very liberal democracies, where we think we have egalitarianism and equal rights, but we silence them in these subtle ways, is really a scandal to what we hope to aspire as a pluralist, mixed, non-judgmental society. You both talked about storytelling and the relevance of storytelling, and I think in some ways, if I can translate that particular story to the academic world, I would say that the majority of women academics in the Islamic tradition or in any religious tradition that I know are all doing gender studies in some way. And I find that slightly puzzling, that there's been a slight shift, and I'm not undermining the importance of that, but is that the only home for so many female academics in religion? And just as there is a snobbery against, men are the writers and women are the readers in our social, intellectual life, there is also in the academic life that real theology, real religion, real thinking, critical, historical, philological, is done by men. And that if you're a female in religious studies or theology, that you're really doing gender, and that's okay, because that might be your limit. But it's not just that it's your limit, it's that women choose to do this. And now I'm seeing a slight shift, that there are some women in religion who are doing what men do, okay? I never saw this world as this bifurcated. It's only recently that I realised. And in the small world of Islamic studies, there isn't a single woman in the UK who does theology across the spectrum, which I find shocking, that there isn't anybody. The women who are in academia are doing gender or reactions to 9/11 or social science of Muslim communities. And I'm not saying that they should or they have to, but it creates this perception that women excel at only certain things, especially in the arts and humanities. I'm not talking about the sciences here. I don't know how we get around that, whether that will change. But that kind of intellectual snobbery, that kind of division exists in every world. And I would not say to anyone here that don't pursue what you want to study, but be aware that if you are going to study that is not considered a man's world, you're going to have to struggle harder to get noticed. I just want to say one thing on stories. I was asked a few years ago, by 6-7 years ago, by the publishers IB Tories to write about myself. I had never thought that I might become a story. And this refers to Elif's remark about how Muslim women are seen, or Muslim women who have a public voice or who are deemed to have done something unusual, they themselves become stories. And I kind of resented that a little bit. I didn't see myself as a story. But the publishers came back last year and said, no, we'd still like you to consider this because you have important things to say. And I said, what important things do I have to say? My research is nothing to do with storytelling or my life. And they said, no, the fact that you're a Muslim woman, that you're a professor in a divinity school that's never had a non-Christian chair. You started in Glasgow as the first woman there, and the first non-Christian and the first non-white. So all these boxes that one ticks. We want to hear that story, but also a story of your journey. Now, at the time, I didn't want to do it, but I have done. It's not a plug for my book. I did it partly because there was a sense that if you don't say certain things, nobody else is going to say them. And it got me thinking about the courage you need to sometimes compromise what you think, I don't really want to touch that, but for the wider good. Because I'm hoping that certain people will read this and they will learn that there is no east-west, male-female dichotomy all the time. We are all connected in so many ways. Our hopes, our desires, our fears, our failures, our memories have so many parallels. Women aren't the only one to tell these stories. But I'm hoping that there will be a male audience for this as well, and I'm hoping that there will be a scholarly audience for this book. Because in some ways, if you think of academic life as purely research that has nothing to say to the modern world, I think especially in the field of religion, then you're missing a trick in our contemporary society. Wherever I go, people's knowledge, and I'm not talking about this audience, but generally people's knowledge of anything to do with religion is so little, is so superficial, is so judgmental, that one feels, or I feel, you have to say other things. And I'm not talking about an apology for religion, I'm not talking about self-criticism, I'm talking about just raising issues. There are so many issues that affect us all that are closeted as religious issues, but they're actually just human concerns. So anyway, I have done this. I have become the story of the story, and I have written this book. And actually it was quite cathartic to actually think about what is it that takes us from an 18-year-old undergraduate to where you are now, and why do some people think that that is an interesting journey? For somebody of my background, my parents, unlike Razia's, I think they would have been horrified if I hadn't gone to university. There was this expectation that you would all go to university, and if you didn't go to university, you would be a dropout. So their expectations were so high, and they never thought, what does it mean to live out those expectations? Their courageous act when they came was to leave the only world they ever knew and to make a new life somewhere else. A kind of courageous act which I don't think I could be capable of. But in doing that, they had so many expectations of their children, because it was almost like, we've done this for a reason. And to be honest, I don't think there's anything wrong with that kind of expectation, except you have to be realistic. Just want to finish on violence and harassment. This is not just, I'm sure you all know, this is not exclusive to the Islamic world. This is everywhere. And the fact that this is everywhere, even where we're sitting today, means that something fundamentally has been left unchallenged in the way women are still perceived. And I don't know the answer to that. Why is it so easy, not just to make subtle discriminations against women, but to be outright violent towards women? And I don't know how women can come together to overcome that, because I don't think it's a woman problem. I just want to end on that. Thank you.